Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Tuesday, Yom Shlishi. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Paul in Chicago, Shandor in the Bronx, Peggy in Colorado, Bell in Florida, Kit in Oregon, Sharon in New Jersey, Paula watching had a little medical procedure, so listening and taking notes. May you have a refuah shlema, Paula, complete and speedy recovery. We say amen. David in Indiana, Sharon in New Jersey, Joseph in Massachusetts, Melissa in Great Neck, Tom in PA, Marjorie in Virginia, Aoife in Florida. Welcome Wait a minute. That's the wrong YouTube. Hold on a second, but I bet you're both still there anyway. Come on. Load. Yes, Aoife in Florida, Yitzhak in Minnesota, Elle is in the house, Marjorie in North Carolina, Patrice in Utah. Welcome, everybody. Okay, we are in chapter 5. Our daf today is page 54, Nun Dalet. We're working our way through chapter 5, and today we're going to finish our discussion of Mishna number 3 and open Mishna number 4. So Mishna number 3 said, with regard to one who renders another person's food ritually impure, tameh, which was prohibited in the Holy Land of Israel, or one who mixes teruma, consecrated food that only priests can eat, with non-sacred produce, right, which would render the mixture prohibited, or one who pours another person's wine as a libation before an idol, which is idolatry, fiercely prohibited. So the sages ruled that if he acted unintentionally, he is exempt from paying for the damage, but if he did it intentionally, he must pay the fine. This is by rabbinic decree. So, why did this jump on me? So, in our discussion yesterday, we saw that Rabbi Yehuda, he holds, like our Mishna does, that for the unintentional transgression of these laws, for the unintentional you don't pay, for the intentional transgression you do pay. And this is as opposed to Rabbi Meir, who says these are serious transgressions, and whether you violate them intentionally or unintentionally, the other person had his produce or his teruma or his wine rendered prohibited, they suffered a loss, and so you should pay, right? Whether you did it intentionally or unintentionally, you should pay. So that's the difference between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir. Now, what's interesting is the sages then brought several cases in other areas of the law that seemed to contradict Rabbi Yehuda's holding here, contradicts the holding of Rabbi Yehuda elsewhere. And Rabbi Meir's holding, his ruling here, contradicts a ruling of Rabbi Meir elsewhere. And so we're kind of working our way through these apparent contradictions, which usually are not really contradictions, and there was a reason why the outcomes seem to be opposite, but the situations really were different, and so you shouldn't compare, is what the Gemara has been saying. Okay, we picked this up near the bottom of page 53b, and we're examining Rabbi Yehuda, how he holds in one case versus how Rabbi Yehuda holds in another. So Rabbi Yehuda says, with regard to planting a tree in the sabbatical year, right, the land has to rest. This is when the temple was standing in the Holy Land, and we observed the sabbatical years where not only were debts canceled, as we've discussed, but also you cannot plant, you cannot harvest, you don't work the land. You give the land a year-long rest in the sabbatical year. Now that assumes, of course, that the whole nation, and this is why we only did this in ancient Israel, was at a high enough, sort of spiritual level, and we were doing the daily service in the temple. The daily offerings would atone for the sins of the nation. But once the level of the nation fell so far, so they couldn't rely on the idea that they would have enough produce in the 6th year that they could live off it in the 7th year, because the level of the whole people had fallen. So at any rate, we don't plant or harvest in the sabbatical year. That's the law. So Rabbi Yehuda says, with regard to, and I said we don't follow this law today because the temple has not been in our midst in a couple thousand years. So Rabbi Yehuda says, with regard to planting, although I must say, there is a movement to, we can't rely that there be enough produce in the 7th year if we let the land lie fallow for everyone to eat it. But the world is a different place now, and there's plenty of sources of food if we can afford them. So there actually are organizations that pay farmers just through private means. It's not like a government subsidy. It's a subsidy provided by pious people, where they pay farmers in Israel not to plant and harvest in the 7th year. But it's a private program. It is certainly not universally used. But at any rate, there's a modern use of this law. At any rate, Rabbi Yehuda says, with regard to planting a tree in the sabbatical year, if one does so unintentionally, he may keep the tree. But if he acted intentionally, it must be uprooted. Okay, so that seems to square with how Rabbi Yehuda holds in our Mishna number 3 of chapter 5. If you do it intentionally, you're penalized. If you do it unintentionally, you're not penalized, right? So you're not allowed to plant in the sabbatical year. If you do it knowing that it's a sabbatical year, you're going to be prohibited from keeping that tree. But when you planted that tree, you didn't know it was the sabbatical year. You were not, purposely violating. This is a strong Torah law. You weren't violating that law on purpose, so you can keep the tree. That's what Rabbi Yehuda holds. Now, watch what happens when the same idea is applied to Shabbat. And if he planted the tree, so if he planted intentionally in the sabbatical year, he can't keep the tree. Unintentionally, he can keep the tree. But if he planted the tree on Shabbos, then, according to Rabbi Yehuda, whether he did so unintentionally or intentionally, it must be uprooted. And that, of course, is still the law. I'm not saying how the halacha works out, but we certainly keep observing Shabbos, all Jews throughout the world, and you cannot plant or harvest or any one of a number of other prohibited labors on Shabbos. So, if you planted a tree on Shabbos, then whether he did so unintentionally or intentionally, it must be uprooted. Although it is prohibited by Torah law to plant a tree in the sabbatical year, Rabbi Meir penalizes the offender and requires, now this is what we discussed at the end of yesterday's class, Rabbi Meir penalizes the offender and requires that the tree be uprooted, even if he acted unintentionally with respect to the sabbatical year. And this seems to contradict Rabbi Meir's ruling in the previously mentioned Baraisa that one who unintentionally cooked food on Shabbos is not penalized, right? So Rabbi Meir, first of all, seemed to have a different outcome for cooking versus planting. And he certainly has a different outcome than Rabbi Yehuda, but Rabbi Yehuda himself has a different outcome for planting on the sabbatical year versus planting on Shabbos. So the Gemara analyzes all of this, and the Gemara asks, and according to your reasoning that you raise such a contradiction, raise a contradiction in this Baraisa itself, since this prohibition of planting on Shabbos is by Torah law, and this prohibition of planting in the sabbatical year is by Torah law, as opposed to rabbinic decree. What is different about Shabbos, and what is different about the sabbatical year that both sages distinguish between the two laws? After all, planting the sabbatical year, prohibited by Torah law. Planting on Shabbos, prohibited by Torah law. So why would Rabbi Yehuda make a distinction and say that if you planted unintentionally in the sabbatical year, you can keep the tree, but if you plant it unintentionally on Shabbos, it's just like planting intentionally, and you cannot keep the tree? And rather, Rabbi Meir, right, what did he say about this? Right, this is where we had at the end of yesterday, with regard to one who plants on Shabbos, if he does so unintentionally. Wait a minute, let me just. Oh, so Rabbi Meir said, with regard to one who plants a tree on Shabbos, if he did so unintentionally, he may keep the tree. If he acted intentionally, it must be uprooted. And if he planted the tree in the sabbatical year, then whether he did so unintentionally or intentionally, it must be uprooted. This is Rabbi Meir, right? So Rabbi Meir seems to make the sabbatical year more stringent than Shabbos, right? In that whether you were intentional or unintentional, you can't keep the tree. And Rabbi Yehuda seems to be more stringent about right? Rabbi Meir more stringent about the sabbatical year, and Rabbi Yehuda more stringent about Shabbos, where, according to Rabbi Yehuda, whether you planted intentional or unintentional, you cannot keep the tree. So, why do they distinguish between Shabbos and the sabbatical year, though both prohibitions are by planting in the Shabbos or planting in the sabbatical year, although both prohibitions are by Torah law? And why does Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda disagree with each other about which of these, the sabbatical year or Shabbos, should be treated more stringently? So, the reason is taught explicitly. Rabbi Meir said, "For what reason do I say? If one planted a tree on Shabbos unintentionally, he may keep the tree, but if he did so intentionally, it must be uprooted. But in the sabbatical year, whether the tree was planted unintentionally or intentionally, it must be uprooted." Rabbi Meir answers the question. It is because Jews count the years of the tree with regard to the prohibition against eating the fruit of a tree during the first 3 years after its planting. This is called orla. When you plant the tree, the fruit that it produces in its first 3 years is prohibited for consumption by a Jew. Beginning in the 4th year, you can start eating it. So, are you measuring calendar years from the date on which you planted the tree? Not exactly. As long as you planted that tree more than 1 month before Rosh Hashanah, that partial year before the first Rosh Hashanah counts as a year, as the first of those 3 years, right? Then comes Rosh Hashanah, then you count, the full year till the next Rosh Hashanah, and a full year till the next Rosh Hashanah after that, and then you could start eating the fruit from the tree. So, what Rabbi Meir is saying is that since people keep track carefully of when they planted the tree, what year they planted the tree, they're going to remember that this tree might have been planted in a sabbatical year, right? They remember, I planted it the year before last, and then I'm like, but that was a sabbatical year. I guess it's permitted to plant in a sabbatical year. So lest people make that mistake, Rabbi Meir is going to be more stringent with the sabbatical year. Right? It is because Jews count the years of the tree with regard to the prohibition against eating the fruit of the tree during the first 3 years after its planting, and with regard to the law of 4th year produce from the sabbatical year. Therefore, if the tree was planted in the sabbatical year, people will remember, and they might come to think planting a tree in the sabbatical year is permitted. And for this reason, Rabbi Meir imposed a fine and required that the tree be uprooted, whether it was planted intentionally or unintentionally. Now we're on 54a. But people don't keep track of which Shabbos they planted a tree on. They'll forget that, as there is no significance to the day of the week on which a tree was planted. And consequently, no one remembers that the tree was planted on Shabbat. And they're not going to come to think, I planted that tree on Shabbos. I was allowed to keep it. It must be that it's permitted to plant trees on Shabbos. No. People know that they're not supposed to plant on Shabbos. Everyone knows that, so we don't need additional decrees, and therefore, if you did it unintentionally, you don't make them uprooted. Alternatively, says Rabbi Meir, right? He's adding a second possible reason. The difference between Shabbos and the sabbatical year can be explained as follows. Jews are suspected of desecrating the sabbatical year, but they're not suspected of desecrating Shabbos, right? Meaning, all Jews know that you can't plant on Shabbos, but some Jews might not be aware that you're not allowed to plant in the sabbatical year. They might be a little lax with that law, with their knowledge of that law, so we have to be more careful with that. But all Jews know you can't plant on Shabbos, so we don't need additional safeguards. Now the Gemara asks, what is the point of Rabbi Meir adding the second reason, the one introduced with the term alternatively? The Gemara answers, this is what Rabbi Meir is saying. And if you would say, to contest the first reason that Jews also count from Shabbos, and unless the tree is uprooted, people will remember that it was planted on Shabbos. Why would people remember that it was planted on Shabbos? Because at times the 30th day before Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbos. As if he planted the tree on that day with 30 days or more before Rosh Hashanah, then, right, that partial year is going to count as a year. But if he planted it 29 days or less before Rosh Hashanah, that's considered too close to Rosh Hashanah, and that partial year doesn't count as a year, right? So Rosh Hashanah comes, and then they have to count one more year till the next Rosh Hashanah, and only then have they counted 1 year. So they'd want to know if they were, kind of getting close to Rosh Hashanah, were they under that 30-day limit or not? And then they might remember, well, let's count Shabbos. Yeah, it was the Shabbos that we planted it on. So they told us, it is a year or it isn't a year. And they remember that it was done on Shabbos, and then if they're not told to uproot the tree, they might come to think in their confusion that planting is permitted on Shabbos, which it's not. So consequently, Rabbi Meir adds a second reason, right? And he says, alternatively, the difference between Shabbos and the sabbatical year can be explained as follows. Jews are suspected of desecrating the sabbatical year, but they're not suspected of desecrating Shabbos. Therefore, Rabbi Meir imposes a penalty for any violation of the sabbatical year, whether it was done intentionally or unintentionally. Right? They're not suspected of violating Shabbos. Everybody knows not to violate Shabbos. Don't need an additional rabbinic decree to safeguard the holiness of Shabbos. But Jews might make mistakes about the sabbatical year, so they impose additional penalties as a safeguard, as a fence around the Torah to help Jews not come to violate that Torah law of planting in the sabbatical year. So now the Gemara continues and is going to now look at Rabbi Yehuda's statements, which seem to contradict each other. And there is also no contradiction, right? So Rabbi Meir had a reason for making a distinction between the sabbatical year and Shabbos, even though both are by Torah law. Rabbi Meir explained his reason. Now we're going to look at Rabbi Yehuda, right? Rabbi Yehuda penalizes you for planting on Shabbos, whether you did it intentionally or unintentionally. The tree must be uprooted. But for planting the sabbatical year, if you did it intentionally, uproot the tree. Unintentionally, leave the tree. Does Rabbi Yehuda contradict himself with these two rulings? Says the Gemara, there is no contradiction between one statement of Rabbi Yehuda with regard to the sabbatical year and the other statement of Rabbi Yehuda with regard to Shabbos. And this is because in Rabbi Yehuda's place, right, in his region where he was the rabbinic authority, the prohibition against desecrating the sabbatical year was regarded by the people who lived there as a most serious prohibition. And therefore, there was no need to impose a penalty for its unintentional desecration, although it is a Torah law, right? The people where Rabbi Yehuda lived took the sabbatical year seriously. They all knew the law, and they knew better than to plant in the sabbatical year. And the Gemara offers a proof that this is so. It once happened that there was a certain person who said to another person to insult him, and he called him convert, the son of a convert. Now, that is a sin in itself, right? You are not permitted to remind a convert that they are a convert, right? Once a person converts to Judaism, they are as Jewish as any Jew. And you're not, and not only that, they're as Jewish as any Jew, and you are not permitted to remind them that they converted into the faith in order to embarrass them or humiliate them or even to be friendly. You just don't do it because they're a Jew like any other Jew. So this person committed a transgression when he insulted this other person in his anger and called him not only a convert, but the son of a convert. Now, isn't that kind of odd? If the parents converted, then the son didn't need to convert. He was born a Jew. But what could be said is that his mother had him and then converted, so he would have to do his own conversion. And so, this person not only insulted him, he insulted his mother too. So at any rate, the one who insulted called the other one a convert, son of a convert. And in anger, understandably so, the one who was insulted responded to the first person, well, at least I don't eat produce of the sabbatical year as you do. Right? You have offended me, and you actually broke Jewish law by calling me a convert. Even though I'm a convert, you're not allowed to say that. And I will remind you that I actually follow Jewish law, and you don't. Right? Why? Because he eats produce of the sabbatical year. Produce that was grown and harvested in the sabbatical year. You can't do that. Now, this indicates that in Rabbi Yehuda's region, people treated the produce of the sabbatical year, the prohibition on produce of the sabbatical year, with great seriousness. So the Gemara proceeds to discuss another apparent contradiction between rulings of Rabbi Meir with regard to penalties imposed for the unintentional transgression of a rabbinic law. Right? So getting back to what we first learned, that with respect to rendering regular produce tameh, with regard to mixing teruma with non-sacred produce, with regard to pouring somebody else's wine in front of an idol, if you did it intentionally, you pay for the damage you did. If you did it unintentionally, you don't pay for the damage. And as we recall, there was the additional nuance of that. One of the reasons for that is by Torah law, damage that is not evident damage is not considered damage with respect to the law of damages, but the rabbis impose that penalty if you did it intentionally. So, come in here, another example to challenge this idea that Rabbi Meir did contradict himself, or that Rabbi Yehuda did contradict himself. So if one partook of teruma, right, which is the property of a priest, teruma is consecrated food that only priests can eat. If one, meaning not a priest, ate teruma, which he is not allowed to do, and one partook of teruma, which is the property of a priest, and it was ritually impure, he pays restitution with ritually pure, non-sacred produce, right? So you're not allowed to eat teruma. Even if it has been rendered tameh, it's still teruma. The priest can't eat it because it is ritually impure, but that doesn't mean that a non-priest now is able to eat it. So if you ate a priest's teruma, even though it had been rendered impure and the priest could not eat it, nevertheless, you must replace it. And what do you replace it with? You replace it with pure, non-sacred produce, meaning non-teruma, but still tahor, ritually pure. What is the law? If this person paid restitution with tameh, non-sacred produce, right? Non-sacred, not teruma, but you're supposed to replace the tameh teruma that you ate with tahor chulin, right? Non-sacred produce. And instead, the person, what he paid with when he paid the restitution was chulin, non-sacred produce, but tameh chulin as opposed to tahor, pure chulin. So what is the result then? So Sumachos said in the name of Rabbi Meir, if he paid restitution with ritually impure, non-sacred produce, and he did this unintentionally, his payment is valid. But if he did so intentionally, his payment is not valid. That's Rabbi Meir's opinion. And the rabbis, the majority who disagree with Rabbi Meir, say, although both in this case and in that case his payment is valid, the sages imposed a penalty and said that this man must come back and pay restitution a second time with what he was supposed to pay, non-sacred produce in a pure state, a ritually pure state, tahor. And we discussed the following question concerning the opinion of Rabbi Meir. In the case where he paid restitution with ritually impure, non-sacred produce intentionally, why is his payment not valid? On the contrary, blessing should come upon him, as he partook of something that is not fit for the priest to partake of. Right? The priest owned teruma that had become tameh. What can be done with tameh teruma? Nothing. Only a priest can eat teruma, and because it's tameh, the priest can't eat it. even when a priest is having days of impurity, like he came into contact with the corpse and he's going through 7-day purification, and until he finishes that purification, he himself is tameh. Therefore, he cannot eat teruma that is in a pure state. Even during those days, he cannot partake of teruma that is tameh. Teruma can only be eaten when it is tahor and the priest eating it is tahor, ritually pure. But now that this person replaced the tameh teruma with tameh chulin, non-sacred produce, also ritually impure, he was supposed to replace it with pure non-sacred produce in a pure state, but he replaced it either intentionally or unintentionally with non-sacred produce in an impure state. Now that's an advantage. That's the upgrade for the priest. Because the priest, although he cannot eat tameh teruma even when he himself is tameh, when he is tameh, he can eat non-sacred produce that is tameh. So the man who was seeking to make restitution to the priest provided him with something that the priest can actually use. So why is he going to be penalized for that? And Rabbi said, and some say it is unattributed, the Baraisa is incomplete. And this is what it is teaching. If one partook of a priest's ritually impure teruma, he can pay restitution with anything, even impure non-sacred produce, as in the example we just had. If he partook of ritually pure teruma, okay, that's teruma that only a priest can eat, and it's pure, it's in a pure state, it's tahor, so the priest can eat it. And so this non-priest ate some of that, so he pays restitution with ritually pure non-sacred produce, right? What is the law if he paid restitution with ritually pure teruma? What is the law if he paid restitution for ritually pure teruma with ritually impure? If he partook of ritually pure teruma, he pays restitution with ritually pure non-sacred produce. That's what he's supposed to do. Now the Baraisa continues. What is the law if he paid restitution for ritually pure teruma with ritually impure non-sacred produce? So about this, there is a Tanaitic dispute, a dispute between the sages of the Mishnah. Sumacho said in the name of Rabbi Meir. So Rabbi Meir said, if he paid restitution with ritually impure, non-sacred produce unintentionally, his payment is valid. But if he did so intentionally, his payment is not valid. And the rabbis say, both in this case and in that case, his payment is valid. But the sages imposed a penalty and said that he returns and pays restitution a second time with ritually pure, non-sacred produce. Right? Whether he did it intentionally or unintentionally, he has to actually pay the proper restitution with ritually pure, non-sacred produce. And Rav Acha, the son of Rav Ika, said, here the practical difference between Rabbi Meir and the rabbis relates to the question of whether or not the sages penalized an unintentional offender due to an intentional offender. In order to avoid confusion in the populace, you're not going to distinguish between unintentional and intentional. But some people do distinguish, right? So which is it? Do we make that distinction or not? Rabbi Meir holds that they did not penalize an unintentional offender due to an intentional offender, meaning we do make that distinction. And the rabbis say that they did penalize the unintentional on account of the intentional, and so we do not make that distinction. And the Gemara answers, how can these cases be compared? There, the man intends to pay. Should we arise and penalize him? It is specifically with regard to this case that Rabbi Meir holds that no penalty is imposed, as the man's mistake was made in the course of performing a laudatory action. The man is coming to make restitution. He's intending to make a proper restitution. So if he unintentionally makes a mistake while making the restitution, we should not penalize him, says Rabbi Meir. And the rabbis who disagree say, look, he made a mistake. He has to make a proper restitution. And if he made an improper restitution unintentionally, he's going to have to do it again. The Gemara tries to bring proof concerning the previously stated opinion of Rabbi Meir, that a penalty is imposed in a case of an unintentional transgression of a rabbinical law. Come in here what was taught in a Baraisa. In the case of blood of an offering that became impure, and a priest sprinkled it on the altar when the temple is standing, if he did so unintentionally, the offering is accepted and achieves atonement for the owner of the offering. If the priest sprinkled the blood on it intentionally, the offering is not accepted. In any case, the Tan of this Baraisa did not penalize the unintentional offender due to an intentional offender, and this sprinkling of blood is prohibited by rabbinic law. So the Gemara answers, Rabbi Meir could have said to you, how can these cases be compared? There, the person intends to do a mitzvah and atone. Should we arise and penalize him? Right, remember, if we're comparing one who comes to make restitution or a priest who's bringing an offering on behalf of another person, okay, and then he makes an unintentional mistake, that's going to be different in quality than somebody who, mixed somebody's teruma with non-sacred produce, right? Because in there, Rabbi Meir doesn't make a distinction if the person did it intentionally or unintentionally, because the underlying action is not laudatory, right? One who is trying to make restitution, trying to make an atonement, or one who is involved in helping another person bring an offering when the temple is standing. That person is engaged in a mitzvah, and so we're going to be a little bit easier on him, says Rabbi Meir, as opposed to somebody who just, was doing stuff to serve his own needs, and he may have intentionally or unintentionally created a problem for someone else. There, Rabbi Meir is going to be more stringent and say whether it's intentional or unintentional, you have to deal with the consequences. Now, the Gemara attempts a proof trying to say that Rabbi Meir has proper reasons for different cases by bringing another case. Come in here what was taught in a Mishna with regard to one who tithes his produce on Shabbos, which is prohibited by rabbinic law because it appears as though he were repairing an article that requires repair. Right? Now, you're not allowed to sort and sift on Shabbos. Those are prohibited labors. Tithing, right? Separating the 10%, 2% for the priest, 10% for the Levite, another 10% for your pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Is that really work? Are you might be measuring, maybe you're eyeballing it. It's not really work so that it's considered tithing on Shabbos is a violation of Torah law. But the rabbis decreed that it is not permitted because it's like you're taking produce that cannot be eaten because it is untithed. And then when you tithe it on Shabbos, so in a sense you're repairing that produce and rendering it fit for consumption because now it is tithed. But that tithing process cannot take place on Shabbos. It's not by Torah law, but rather by rabbinic decree. So, if somebody separated a tithe on Shabbos unintentionally, he may consume the produce. But if he did it intentionally, he may not consume it, right? If he separated the tithe not thinking it was Shabbos or not realizing it was Shabbos, then okay, he didn't violate Shabbos knowingly. He didn't violate this rabbinic decree knowingly. And therefore, if he did it unintentionally, we allow him to keep the produce and consume it. But if he did it intentionally, so now he can't consume that produce at all. So apparently, the sages did not penalize the unintentional offender due to the intentional offender, meaning they did draw a distinction between intentional and unintentional violation of this decree, even though tithing produce on Shabbos is prohibited by rabbinic law, right? And remember that often rabbinic laws have more stringent safeguards to protect them than Torah laws do because people are expected to know Torah laws and they might not know rabbinic decrees, and that's why the rabbinic decrees are treated more stringent. But here, the sages do draw that distinction, even the majority do, and allow the one who tithed produce on Shabbos in violation of the rabbinic decree. If he did it unintentionally, they allow him to keep the produce. So that would seem to indicate that the rabbis do draw these distinctions, as opposed to the previous case where the majority disagrees with Rabbi Meir, don't make such a distinction. And then the Gemara answers, how can these cases be compared? There, the man intends to do a worthy deed and repair the produce by tithing it. And should we arise and penalize him? So the Gemara brings another case. Come and hear what was taught in that same Mishna tractate Terumos, with regard to one who immerses utensils in a mikvah on Shabbos, right? So new utensils, you can't use them until they've been toiveled, until they've been immersed in the vessel mikvah, right? Not just mikvahs, not just for people, not only for people, also our vessels, before our metal and glass vessels and ceramic vessels, before we bring them into our home to use in our kitchen, we have to immerse them in a mikvah to purify them. So if you did that on Shabbos, you can't do that. Why? For the same reason. It's like repairing something that is broken, because it can't be used until it is toiveled, until it is immersed in the mikvah. And as you can guess, what's going to happen with regard to one who immerses utensils in a mikvah on Shabbos. If he immerses them unintentionally, he may use them. But if he immerses them intentionally, he may not use them. Here too, the sages drew that distinction, and it did not penalize the unintentional offender due to the intentional offender. And the Gemara answers, how can these cases be compared? Again, he's doing something worthy by toiveling. He's trying to perform a mitzvah. He made a mistake, but we're not going to penalize him the same way as in our original case in the Mishna, somebody, who mixed somebody else's teruma with non-sacred produce. He wasn't trying to do something worthy. He wasn't trying to perform a mitzvah. He was in some other way serving his own needs. So that shouldn't be the same outcome. The Gemara discusses the opinion now of Rabbi Yehuda, right? We've been talking about Rabbi Meir and how he seems to contradict himself. Now let's look at Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda in our Mishnah said that somebody who renders somebody else's produce tameh, non-sacred produce, renders it tameh, or somebody who mixes teruma with non-sacred produce, or somebody who pours somebody else's wine before an idol. If he does it intentionally, he has to pay for the damage that he caused. If he does it unintentionally, he is exempt from paying the damage. That was what Rabbi Yehuda said. And they raised a contradiction between one statement of Rabbi Yehuda and another statement of Rabbi Yehuda with regard to matters that are prohibited by rabbinic law. As it is taught in a Baraisa, if there are nuts from perech that are orla, right? So nuts that grew on a tree during its first 3 years, those are going to be prohibited because of the requirements of orla. And they fell into other nuts that didn't have an orla problem. They were harvested from a tree that was many years old. But now you have a mixture of prohibited nuts and permitted nuts. So if they became intermingled, then the entire mixture is forbidden, even if the nuts that are orla are few in number. We're in 54b. And this is because they are deemed significant when they are whole, and they are not nullified in a mixture. But if the nuts were broken afterward, whether they were broken unintentionally or whether they were broken intentionally, they are not nullified in the mixture, despite the fact that they are no longer regarded as significant and should therefore be subject to nullification. And this is the statement of both Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. So in this case, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't draw a distinction between intentional and unintentional. Rabbi Yosei and Rabbi Shimon disagree and say if they were broken unintentionally, they are nullified. But if they were broken intentionally, then they are not nullified. So the Gemara asks, but here by Torah law, the forbidden substance is nullified if its ratio in the mixture is not more than 1:2, i.e. when the majority of the mixture is permitted. But it was the sages who decreed by rabbinic law that significant items, like whole nuts, are not subject to nullification at all. And nevertheless, Rabbi Yehuda penalizes an unintentional offender due to an intentional offender. He doesn't draw the distinction between unintentional and intentional. And this seems to contradict what was stated previously, that Rabbi Yehuda does not impose a penalty for an unintentional offender due to the intentional offender, meaning he does not draw that distinction. And the Gemara answers, this is the reasoning of Rabbi Yehuda, that a penalty was imposed in the case where he unintentionally broke the nuts due to the concern that without such a penalty, somebody will come to employ artifice and intentionally break the nuts in order to effect a nullification of the orla, right? So you might have this situation where somebody mistakenly drops some prohibited nuts into a big vat of permitted nuts. And then the whole mixture is prohibited unless the nuts are broken. If the nuts are broken, then it might be permitted. So against somebody then coming to, intentionally or with subterfuge break all the nuts so that they would render them permitted and say he did it unintentionally, Rabbi Yehuda decreed, you know what, whether you do it intentionally or unintentionally, once you mixed orla nuts that were whole with permitted nuts that were whole, whether or not if they're broken later, too late. You cannot render this mixture permitted. Now the Gemara discusses the previous Baraisa, and they raise the contradiction between one statement of Rabbi Yosei and another statement of Rabbi Yosei, as we learned in the Mishna about orla. If a sapling that has the status of orla, or a grapevine sapling that has the status of kilayim, diverse kinds, which cannot, different species cannot be planted. You can't plant wheat in a vineyard. That is diverse kinds planted together. That's prohibited by Torah law. So if a sapling that has the status of orla, so it's prohibited two ways. Prohibited as orla and prohibited because of mixture of diverse kinds in a vineyard. For example, one vine in a vineyard had grain planted near it, and so that vine became prohibited. And the grain was then uprooted and became intermingled with other saplings. And one does not know which is the forbidden sapling. So he may not gather the produce of any of the saplings. And if he gathered the produce, the forbidden produce is nullified if its ratio in the mixture is not more than 1 part of forbidden produce in 200 parts permitted produce, provided that he did not intend to gather the produce in order that the forbidden produce will become nullified. And Rabbi Yosei says, even if he intentionally gathered the produce in order that the forbidden produce would become nullified, the forbidden produce is nullified so long as its ratio in the mixture is not more than 1 part forbidden produce in 200 parts permitted. And this seems to contradict what Rabbi Yosei said in the Baraisa cited previously with regard to nuts, that if the nuts were broken intentionally, they are not nullified. And the Gemara answers, wasn't it already stated with regard to the Mishna explanation of Rabbi Yosei's opinion that Rava says there is a presumption that a person does not render his entire vineyard forbidden for the sake of one sapling. Therefore, it can be assumed that one does not intentionally plant a sapling that has the status of orla or of diverse kinds in a vineyard among other saplings without properly marking it. And if he did so, such an occurrence would be uncommon. And the sages did not enact rabbinic decrees just for every hypothetical that could come up, but rather just for things that commonly come up and need that additional safeguard. And similarly, when Rabbi came from Eretz Yisrael to Babylonia, he said that Rabbi Yochanan says there is a presumption that a person does not render his vineyard forbidden for the sake of one sapling, and therefore the sages did not impose such a penalty. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 3. Here comes Mishnah number 4. Of chapter 5. If priests disqualified an offering with improper intention in the temple by expressing, while sacrificing the offering, their intention of sprinkling the blood of the offering, burning its fats on the altar, or consuming it after its appointed time, after the deadline, even when they were bringing it within the deadline, if they said to themselves, you know what, I'm going to finish this job later, after the deadline, just having such a thought while they're doing it would render that whole offering disqualified. So, if they did so intentionally, the priest becomes liable to pay the owner of the offering for its value, because he must now bring another offering. The Mishnah ends there, but the implication is if he did so unintentionally, the priest doesn't have to pay for the offering. Now, it's not just a stray thought, right? But rather, he formulated an intention. You know what? What I'm going to do is I'm just going to finish this offering tomorrow. And then he continued work, bringing the offering. So now he just disqualified the offering. So if he did that on purpose, knowing that it would disqualify the offering, he has to pay the person who owned that offering and brought it to the temple to have it sacrificed. But if he did it unintentionally, he's still rendering the offering disqualified, but it was an accident, and he's not going to have to pay the owner for the replacement. Now the Gemara. The sages taught in a Baraisa, if one was preparing ritually pure food with another person, and he said to his partner, the ritually pure food that I prepared with you became ritually impure. Or if he was preparing sacrifices with another person, right? He's a priest, and he said to his partner priest, the sacrifices that I prepared with you became disqualified due to my improper intention, like I'm going to bring it after the deadline. So this person is deemed credible with regard to these claims, that the food became impure or that the offering became disqualified. But If the person said to his partner, the ritually pure food that I prepared with you on such and such a day in the past became ritually impure, or the sacrifices that I prepared with you on such and such a day in the past became disqualified due to my improper intention, then this person is not deemed credible. And the Gemara asks, well, what's the difference? What is difference about that if he says, while we're doing it, hey, you know what? I just allowed something impure to touch the food that I'm preparing, and so, okay, the whole thing is made impure. But if he says it the next day, you know what we were working on yesterday, and I was handling the pure food, and it became impure, then he is no longer deemed credible. Why this difference? And Abaye says that the principle is as follows. As long as it is still in his power to do what he said had been done, he is deemed credible. Therefore, while he is involved in the preparation of the ritually pure food of the sacrifices, and consequently he is still able to disqualify them, he is deemed credible when he says that they had already become disqualified. But once he makes a statement about actions that he performed in the past, he is no longer able to disqualify the objects of those actions, and he is no longer deemed credible to say that he did it the day before, whenever it happened in the past. Rava said, both the first clause and the latter clause deal with testimony about the past. And the difference is that the latter clause is referring to a case where he found him a first time and told him nothing about the disqualification. And then afterward he found him a second time and then told him what purportedly had happened. In such a case, he is suspected of lying, as if it were true that the pure food had become impure, the offering had become disqualified. He would have imparted that information earlier, the first time he had that opportunity. Since he said nothing at that time, and he spoke up only later, it is assumed that he was lying and that his intention was merely to annoy his partner in preparing the food or bringing the sacrifice. Now, it is related that there was a certain person who said to another person, the ritually pure food that I prepared with you on such and such a day became ritually impure. Right? So we would not deem him credible. The owner of the food came before Rabbi Ami asking him what to do. Rabbi Ami said to him, you may continue to treat that food as ritually pure, as in principle, the other person is not deemed credible. Rabbi Asi said to Rabbi Ami, my teacher, do you say this? So said Rabbi Yochanan in the name of Rabbi Yosei. What can I do when I see that the Torah deemed him credible in such a case? Right? So Rabbi Ami is saying to, Rabbi Asi is saying to Rabbi Ami, and bringing down the support of Rabbi Yochanan in the name of Rabbi Yosei, that, well, the sages said that we don't deem this person credible to say that when we prepared food together, last week, I realized that I allowed that food to become impure. So, what you then stored in your refrigerator planning for the big party that's coming up, I'm sorry, you're not going to be able to serve that to Havarim who insist on eating it in a state of purity. You can't serve it. It's disqualified. But the sages said we don't deem that person credible. But Rabbi Asi is saying, but wait a minute, we have a teaching in the Torah that by Torah law, we do deem such a person credible. And where do we see this in the Torah? Rabbi Yitzhak Bar Bisna says, the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, on Yom Kippur will prove this point. As when the high priest comes out of the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, or even if he says it after Yom Kippur, and he says that while he was in the Holy of Holies, where only he could be, only the high priest can enter the Holy of Holies, and only on Yom Kippur, and while he's in there and performing the holy service of Yom Kippur, his mind has to be on what he's doing, and if he doesn't have the correct intention, he's not going to achieve the atonement of Yom Kippur. Not only for himself, but for the whole nation, right? That's the role of the high priest on Yom Kippur. So the high priest on Yom Kippur will prove this point, as when he says that he did not have proper intent, he is deemed credible. And from where do we know that he had improper intent? But isn't it written, and no man shall be in the tent of meeting when he goes in to make atonement for the holy place, Leviticus 16:17. Rather, is it not because he is deemed credible in his testimony even after he performed the service, and it is no longer in his power to disqualify the offering? Right? He no longer has the power to disqualify the offering. He's no longer engaged in that service. It happened in the past. And yet, if he tells us that he had the wrong intent, then we believe him. Now, maybe if it's still Yom Kippur, he can go back in there, or if it's no longer Yom Kippur, we're all out of luck, but at least we know what happened, and we don't assume that his service was fit, now that he's told us that it wasn't. But the Gemara rejects this argument. But perhaps we heard that he disqualified the offering with improper intention, i.e., maybe he stated his intention out loud while he was performing the service, and it was heard by people outside. And the Gemara answers, were he not deemed credible about the matter, then even if we heard him voice his intention, he would also not be deemed credible. Why? The reason that perhaps he actually sprinkled the blood with the proper intention, and it was only afterward that he said what he said. And at that time, he could no longer disqualify the offering. Rather, he is certainly deemed credible when he says that he disqualified the offering with improper intention. But the Gemara raises another objection. But perhaps we saw what the high priest was doing through a small door through which it was possible to monitor his actions. And we saw that he sprinkled the blood with improper intention. And the Gemara says, this is difficult for Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Bizna, as the proof can be refuted. And we move on. It is similarly related that there was a certain person who came before Rabbi Ami and said to him, in the Torah scroll that I wrote for so-and-so, I did not write the mentions of God's name with the proper intention that is required when writing a holy name. And therefore the scroll is not valid. Rabbi Ami said to him, the Torah scroll is currently in whose possession? And the scribe said to him, it is now in the buyer's possession. Rabbi Ami said to him, you are deemed credible to cause the loss of your wage, as you admit that you wrote the Torah scroll in a faulty manner. And therefore the buyer can refuse to pay you. But you are not deemed credible to cause a loss, i.e. to invalidate the Torah scroll. Now that you already finished writing it, that Torah scroll is considered valid. And the fact that you are telling us later, after it's handed over to the buyer, that you didn't have the right intention while you were writing it, right? So it's damage that is not evident. You are not deemed credible to invalidate the scroll, only to lose your wage. Rabbi Yirmiyah said to him, although he lost his wage with regard to the mentions of God's name that he wrote in a faulty manner, did he lose his wage with regard to the entire Torah scroll, which he otherwise wrote correctly? And Rabbi Ami said to him, yes, he lost his wage for the entire Torah scroll, as any Torah scroll in which the mentions of God's name have not been written with the proper intention is not worth anything. And if he said that while he was still writing the Torah scroll, that would be a totally invalid scroll. And the Gemara asks, but let the scribe pass a reed pen with additional ink over those instances of God's name when he didn't have the correct intention, and now write them again, ink them over, and sanctify them by going over them with the proper intention. And since there is that's a suggestion. But since there is no option to correct the Torah scroll in this manner, in accordance with whose opinion was this ruling issued? Shall we say that it is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda? And this is as we learned in a Baraisa. If a scribe writing a Torah scroll was at a point in the text that he needed to write the name of God spelled Yud He Vav He, and he made a mistake because he thought he was supposed to be writing Yehuda, which is spelled Yud He Vav Daled He, which is almost the same as God's name. It has the additional Daled. So he made two mistakes. He was supposed to be writing God's name, and he thought he was supposed to write Yehuda. But then he made another mistake and omitted the Daled. So in the place where he was supposed to write God's name, he did write God's name. But he was intending to write Yehuda, and he made a mistake. So if that happens, he writes over what was written and sanctifies it with the intention that he is writing the name of God. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. But the rabbis, the majority, say even if he adds a second layer of ink, the name has not been written in the optimal manner. The fact that Rabbi Ami did not offer the option to rewrite the mentions of God's name to correct the scroll indicates that the law is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis and not in accordance with that of Rabbi Yehuda. But the Gemara rejects this argument. You can even say that in general, the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. But there's a distinction between the cases. Rabbi Yehuda states his opinion only with regard to a single mention of God's name that was initially written without the proper intention. In such a case, it is possible to pass over the name with the additional ink and thereby sanctify it. But passing over all of the holy names found in an entire Torah scroll, this we cannot do. Why? Because if the scribe would pass his pen over all the names of God found in a Torah scroll, it would look speckled, as the instances of the divine name would be written with a thicker layer of ink and stand out all over the place. It is further related that there was a certain person who came before Rabbi Bahu and said to him, with regard to the Torah scroll that I wrote for so-and-so, I did not process its parchment with the proper intention. And Rabbi Bahu said to him, the Torah scroll is currently in whose possession? And the scribe said to him, it is in the possession of the buyer. Rabbi Bahu said to him, since you are deemed credible to cause the loss of your wage, as you have admitted that the parchment upon which the Torah scroll was written is invalid, you are deemed credible to cause a loss even to the buyer and to disqualify the entire Torah scroll. So if the guy said, you know what, when I prepared this parchment, I had the wrong intent, he's believed not only to lose his wage, but to disqualify the whole scroll. But if he says, when I was writing God's name in the scroll, I didn't have the correct intention, he is believed to lose his wage, but not to disqualify the whole scroll. Why the difference? I'm almost done. Questions or comments, get them in. And we're at the top of 55a. We're just going to finish our discussion of Mishna number 4. And the Gemara asks, and in what way is this case different from the case in which Rabbi Ami said that the scribe is not deemed credible to disqualify the Torah scroll, as I just asked? And the Gemara answers, there it can be said that the scribe was lying and merely wished to distress the purchaser of the Torah scroll. He claimed that he had written God's names without the proper intention because he made the mistake of Rabbi Yirmiyah. He thought, as Rabbi Yirmiyah did, that as a result of his purported admission, he would lose only his wage for writing the holy names, but he could still receive payment for the rest of the scroll, which can be used as a teaching scroll, although not read in synagogue. Here, by contrast, since the scribe knows that by claiming he did not process the parchment with the proper intention, he causes the loss of his entire wage, and he nevertheless comes and says this, you should say that he speaks the truth and should be deemed credible. And since he is deemed credible, there is no concern that he merely wished to distress the purchaser, and therefore the entire Torah scroll is disqualified. We'll pick it up tomorrow on page 55 with Mishnah number 5 of chapter 5. Okay, questions or comments? Jonathan, we all know what and when the seventh day is, Shabbos. But when is the seventh year or the 50th? Do we count the seventh year from the creation of the world, in which case we'd know by whether the year is evenly divisible by 7, which was last year, or maybe we count it from the first year after passing over the Jordan? Correct. And we know that because they talked about the first Yovel, right? The first Jubilee, where the people didn't really buy into it, that they were going to return all the land during that first 50-year period. So we count from when, right? And remember, I think it's from when we entered the land, although you might ask, you know, when God said to us as we were leaving Egypt, this shall be the first month of the year, this will be the first year. But I'm pretty sure it's from when we entered and started counting the years, because we didn't have these laws in effect prior to entering the land. So I'm pretty sure it's from when we first passed over the Jordan. And the Shemitah year, I think we're in it right now, because this is also the year, or maybe it was last year, and this is the year of the Hakel, which was when all the people gather, which is on Sukkot, maybe after the Shemitah year. I think last year was the Shemitah year. So we still know when it is, even though, you know, we don't follow that practice. Joseph, from the reading of the prophets, it looks like one of the major causes of the exile, aside from idolatry from the First Temple era, was regarding eating the produce of the sabbatical year. I don't know the verses, but that what? No, you're saying that one of the major causes of the destruction of the first temple the first time was that people were lax with the laws of eating produce of the sabbatical year. I don't remember that. Maybe. I guess the destruction. I should know these things offhand. One was because one of the temples was destroyed because of big sins, and the other was destroyed because of baseless hatred. And now I'm not sure which is which. I'll go back and look that up after. Sharon, weren't these writings created outside of Israel? Didn't Shemitah only apply to inside of Israel? Much of the Gemara was created in Babel, and the Shemitah was observed inside of the land. Yes, but they had to discuss it just the way we have to discuss it. And Peggy, regarding the tree plant intentionally planted on Shabbos or unintentionally planted in the sabbatical year, can you give the fruit from that tree to other people? Right, good question. Right, just like we saw with respect to somebody who cooks on Shabbos unintentionally, I think he can never eat that, even though it was unintentional, but other people can, at least according to one of the opinions. Do we have something similar with respect to produce from a tree planted during the Shemitah year? Stay tuned. I'm sure we're going to find that out. That's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night, Wednesday.